Hello and welcome to my second visual scripting tutorial for CraftStudio. In this tutorial we're going to look at writing scripts that help us move around in 3D space. And what we're going to need to do first of all is to try and understand what 3D space is, so we can actually manipulate that and make our objects, our game objects, move about in it. It's the 3 in 3D that is the interesting part. The 3 stands for 3 dimensions. You need height, you need width, and you need depth. And if you have those 3 things together, you've created something that looks like it's in 3 dimensions. It's 3D. And the model that I've created really kind of represents those 3 dimensions. We've got our height, and we've got our depth, and we've got our width. And I've represented them by using these axes, rather like on a graph. So what we could do is we can actually plot the Z and the X and the Y value to plot something in 3-dimensional space. So if we change the Z, it'll move along this axis here. And if we change the X, if we make it positive, it'll move in this direction. If we make it negative, we put a minus in front of it, it'll move in that direction. And the same with the vertical as well. So let's just jump straight in and start making a script. So what I've done is I've already, kind of like Blue Peter, I've already made a script already, and that's on the left hand side. So first things first, we're going to introduce you to some new blocks. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to use this move value of self game object by global offset. Okay, we're going to do that one first, and you're going to find the move section in the game objects tab. And the reason for that is we are moving the game object. If we look at our scene, we'll just remember that there's our player, that's our empty game object, and we attach things to it. It's already got its position attached, but we've added a model and we also add a scripted behavior. And that XYZ scripted behavior is the one we're working on right now. So this scripted behavior is sitting inside this game object. And we must remember that that's the game object, not the model. So what we're going to do is we go to game object and we look down here and we find position. So we're going to look at position. We want to move our game object along its axes. So we're going to drag this in and clip it into on update. So let's tell this this move by global what we want it to move. It says here game object, but if I click in there then nothing happens. I'm going to need to add a value of. We can get that from variables, and I drag this in and lock it into this position here. And it says value of variable. Well, we're going to write this, and you've got to write it exactly as I'm writing it. So it's going to be self dot, which says the thing that you're in, the game object that is yourself, game object, and we have to write it game object like this: little game, big capital O, and then BJECT. If you write it differently, for example, if we have a big S like that, this little question mark pops up because it's thinking, I don't know what you're talking about. So let's just put a little S there, and that means, and I'll talk about the P's and things like that. I'm going to do a whole tutorial about variables, but not right now. Let's just concentrate on moving ourselves about. The next thing we're going to do is, so we're going to move the game object by its global position. We've also got local and orientated, and we'll talk about them a bit later on. And offset vector, and the vector is just those 3 numbers, the X, Y, and Z. And let's just go into maths and find the 3 numbers for our 3D. So remember that we've got X, Y, and Z, and if we change any of these numbers, then what we're doing is we offset the object, the game object, by whatever value along that axis. So first of all, let's move this along its, well, let's have a look at it first. Let's move it along its Z. Okay, so we're going to go in here, and if I put a big number in, it might zip past us really quickly. So I'm going to put a little number in. So I'm going to put 0.05. Okay, and that's our project done. So just make sure in our scene we've got the scripted behavior inside our game object. That seems all right. We'll just go back here. We'll go to our administration and make sure our startup scene is connected, so that's the startup scene. That seems okay as well. So if we press play, if we press play, we can see that the object is moving along the z-axis, and it'll move along forever and ever because it's in that update, and that's updating 60 times a second. So it's moving it a little bit, and then it's moving a little bit more, and moving a little bit more, and it's moving along there. So that seems cool. So let's do something a bit more interesting with that now. What we want it to do is when we press a button, we want it to move along that axis as well. Okay, so first of all, we go back into administration, and we want to go to game controls up here. So let's add a button, and we're going to call this Z. And we'll just click on it, and we can see that it's a button. Okay, we can have an axis, but we're having a button. It's going to have the keyboard as our input source, and the key is going to be, we just select here and press Z on your keyboard, and that's it, it's done. We've set up our first button. So then we can go back to our script, and we can say, go to input, oh no, we want to go to flow, and we say if, so we're going to say if, and there's a Boolean statement, and that means if something is true or false. So if Z is down, which is true, okay, then move the self-game object by global and offset it by 0.5. So whenever that button is down, it's going to move it by this, and it's going to repeat this 60 times a second. So it's going to feel smooth and animated. So let's test that out, see if it works. So the runtime report's working, and there if we look behind, we can see there's our model. And now if I press Z on the keyboard, we can see that whenever I'm pressing it, press, it's moving along the z-axis. Brilliant. So what we can do now is we can add other buttons. So let's just create some more buttons. So if we go back to our administration cog and go to our game controls, we're going to add button X, add, and in button X we say you're going to be X, thank you. And then we're going to add another button, which is button Y, and we'll add that, and we'll go to Y, and we'll just make sure that that is pressed in there. So we've got Z, X and Y. We'll go back to our Visual Script, and we're going to just do this. So we're going to select this block here, and I'm going to press Command D to duplicate that. I'm going to duplicate it again. So very quickly we can kind of generate more code. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to change this is button down, is button Y down over here, and instead of changing that, I'm going to change this one, so it's going to 0.05 in the Y section, and in this section, which is X, I'm going to, can you guess, change the X value 0.5. Okay, and then when I run this program, let's take a look at it. When I press Z, it's moving along on Z. When I press X, it's moving along X. And when I press Y, it moves along Y. Now, unfortunately, it's only going in one direction. That's because we've only given it positive numbers. What we need to do is add some negative numbers there. So to turn this around, what we need to do is that I'm going to duplicate this one here. Okay. And instead of is button Z down, and instead of having a positive number, we're going to put a minus in front of that. And at the moment it says if button Z is down. Now I could choose a different button on the keyboard, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little trick. I want to press the Alt button and Z. And whenever I press the Alt button and Z, I want it to go backwards. So I'm going to go and create a new button in my administration tab, which is the Alt. And we're going to add that. On our Alt key, I'm going to press Alt on my keyboard. And I'm using a Mac keyboard, which is why it's saying right Alt. Okay, great. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to add an extra condition to that if statement. So we're going to have to add the if the Z button is down and if the Alt key is down, then do this. And you can find this in the Flow tab, and there's two Boolean statements, two true or falses. So we'll add those together just like this. So if the Alt key is down, Alt, and the Z key is down, yeah, it should do that, shouldn't it? Well, that's what you'd think, but then in actual fact, this is what happens. Let's run the script. So I'm pressing the Alt key and the Z key at the same time, and nothing happens. It kind of freezes. If I press Z on its own, it just still moves along the Z axis. And the reason for that is both of the statements, both of the if statements, are true. Okay, so the Booleans come out with yes, do it. So the Z, is the Z button down? Yes, it's down. It's being pressed down. Even if you're still pressing the Alt button, the Z button's being pressed down. So the next one is true too. And what happens is both of them cancel each other out, and that's why it looks like it's just freezing. So what we have to do is add another condition, which is a not true. So I need to add if the Z button is down and not, let's duplicate that, the Alt button, then we do this. But if the Alt button down and the Z button is down together, then we do that. So let's test this out and see if it works. Okay, so there's Z, so I'm pressing Z, and if I press Alt and Z, it moves backwards, moves forwards, moves backwards. So now I can move it around along that axis, forwards and backwards. So let's just add that to the rest of the script. Okay, there we go, we've finished it. So let's see what we're doing in each section. So I've made a Z section. This is we can just comment on each section, and these comments don't really mean a thing. It's just a nice way of sort of grouping things together and making sense of stuff. So in Z section, if the Z button and not the Alt button is pressed, then you can move in a positive along the positive Z axes. But if the Alt button and the Z button is down, then you can move in the negative axes. And the same with all of these. So make sure you've got a positive and a negative, a positive and a negative, and you can change these values to make it travel faster or slower along these axes. And next week we're going to be looking at variables and how we can use them to change values on the fly and across the board. But not this week. We'll stick with our numbers. So when you've figured out all this, we can run our project, and let's have a look at what it looks like. So here I am, I'm pressing Z and X and Y, and I'm pressing the Alt key, and we can kind of move ourselves around 3D space. And then you can press them both at the same time, and you can make it move in diagonals and all sorts. Okay, so now that we know how to move around in 3D space, let's apply that to our character. And obviously I'm coming back to RoboDoc here, and what I want to do is I want to apply all that knowledge and script RoboDoc so RoboDoc can move around a map. So what I've got is I've got RoboDoc. I've also created, let's have a look here, I've also created a map. Really simple map made of blocks with a few obstacles. We'll talk about collisions again much later on, but we're not going to collide. I think we're just going to be. This is just a movement one, but it's nice to see something that RoboDoc can move around in. And this is our script, and there are some differences in this script. So let's just have a little look at the differences that we've got. So I've got, you might recognize this, if, and this is a true or false statement, if is button down forward, and I've created some buttons, so let's just pop you into administration. I've created 4 buttons: forward, turn left, back, and turn right. Let's have a look at these buttons. So, and this is a bit more traditional kind of keyboard. This is how I play video games myself. So forward is W on the keyboard, back is S, turn left is A, and turn right is D. So let's see how this is all put together. So if I push the button down, which is forward, I move the self-game object by its oriented offset. And what oriented offset means is whichever direction the game object is actually facing in it itself. So it's using its own axes, and it's going to move positively along its z-axis, or if it was going backwards it would move negatively. If we press the back button, for example, we would be moving negatively along its z-axis. Do you remember which z was? Z is blue, so it's going to move forward along that object. So there's our duck. So it's going to move along that position, the z position. And then we've added 2 more. Now this is how we rotate an object through space. So I've got the duck to turn, and so as if it's turning left, if A is pressed really, then rotate value of self-game object by its global position by Euler angles, and we're doing the Y, which is the vertical. So we're rotating around its vertical position, so it's really spinning. And an Euler angle is how you rotate an object in 3D space. That's the maths behind it. And the same with that. If you turn it right, and you can find these rotate ones in back to game object, and we look for orientation, and there it is. In orientation, rotate game object by Euler angles. It took me ages to be able to figure out how to pronounce it. Hopefully I am pronouncing it right. I went to great lengths to figure it out. But anyway, so that's how we move all this. I've made a game scene, a little bit like the one before, where we put the player, a camera. We've added a camera to that object, and we've added a map to this object, and I call this one Duck Pond. So let's just play this and see what it looks like. So there we go, there's our duck moving around, pressing reverse, and it's doing quite well, zipping around. Well, hey! Now, what I want to do is I want the camera to follow the duck. So if we go back to game, it's remarkably simple to do. All we have to do is make the camera, the cam, part of the player. So we attach it to its hierarchy, and then the camera will follow what the player does. Let me just show you, and you'll be able to see. So now, when I move the duck with my keyboard, so I'm pressing W for forward, and I'm rotating it, it's moving around. The camera's being dragged along with that duck. And that's just a nice quick easy way of getting your object, your game object, with all its associated bits and pieces, the model and the duck and everything, to animate, to move through your scene that you've created. And so next time we're going to be looking at variables, as I've said before, and we'll also look at animation and how to get this little duck to move its legs when we press these buttons too. So until next time, thanks for listening, and I hope you've learnt something. And if you have any questions or anything like that, please leave them in the comments, and if you watched it all the way through, please do give us a like as well. That'd be really useful. Thanks very much now. Bye bye.